Everyone, and welcome to the International Society for the Study of Rural Crimes session. Today's event is a panel on the impact of natural resources and energy development on rural crime. I'll be your moderator. My name is Matt Thomas, and I'm at California State University, Chico. We have four distinguished panelists with us today. We have Jeffrey Jaquette from The Ohio State University, Christopher O'Connor from Ontario Tech University, Thomasine Heitkamp from the University of North Dakota, and Rick Rudell from the University of Regina. Each of them will be talking for approximately 13 minutes, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A, and you can just raise your hand, and I'll call on people in the order that they raise their hand during the Q&A. So first, we'll turn it over to Jeffrey.
Well, you guys can see that all right? Rick, Dr. Ruddle had asked me to sort of give a overview, just sort of introduction to the concept of energy boomtowns and natural resource development and how it relates to crime and criminal justice. So very pleased to be doing that. I just want to give you just a real brief introduction about myself. I had sort of cut my teeth looking at studying the sociological sort of impacts of natural gas development in Western Wyoming for a number of years in the 2000s. Did a fair amount of work on sort of local community impacts from boomtown development in Wyoming, including working with the sheriff's departments and local law enforcement, emergency management services, as well as a whole bunch of other sort of variables and factors related to boomtown growth in Wyoming, and learned quite a bit of it there. After that, decided to go get a PhD at Cornell, right as the Marcellus Shale was heating up, and in New York and Pennsylvania, and was able to sort of study the different types of growth that was happening as it relates to the Marcellus. Lived in South Dakota for a few years. I've done some work on the boom going on in North Dakota, in Williston, and also sort of like communities that were on sort of the outskirts of the boom, which we termed the Goldilocks communities, as it turned related to boomtown development. And then more recently at Ohio State University, I've been looking at not so much boomtown communities, but communities that are impacted by coal developments and are sort of in the midst of the energy transition away from coal. And that's sort of a whole different story in a way. Happy to talk about all these experiences, but for my talk, I just wanted to sort of just go over the basics of this idea of the boomtown, drawing from a paper way back from 2014, published in the lovely Canadian Journal of Rural and Community Development, which is open access. So where does boomtown get its name? We usually think of boomtown as this explosion, boom in developments, happens very quickly. But really boomtown is all about these guys, the boom rats, working on these timber booms that were the big timber rafts that would float downstream. And so these towns would spring up where these timber rafts were being either loaded up or unloaded at the sawmill. And so these towns that would spring up during this time would be called boom towns, not to be confused with the Irish 80s punk band, the Boomtown Rats, although presumably that is what their name is referring to. Hamlin Garland, I don't know if this quote might sort of be familiar to people. So he's talking about his boomtown, timber boomtown of Onalaska, Wisconsin in the late 1800s. It's a rude, rough little camp filled with raftsmen, loggers, mill hands, and boomsmen. Saloons abounded and deeds of violence were common, but to me, it was a poem. And I love that quote because I feel like it summarizes so much of the activity in these boomtowns. Also found this logger's vocabulary, and they termed a boomer as a man who doesn't stay long on any job, generally 3 days to 3 weeks, one who works just long enough to get a liquor steak and the wrinkles out of his belly. And I'm not exactly sure what that means, but sort of get the idea when it comes to these sort of short-term transient workforces. Here's some more stuff from Unalaska, where Hamlin Garland was from, and what he's talking about, some pictures of like the booming timber boom town during this time period in the late 1800s. Just a few boomtown qualities, like just generally speaking, really broad brush stuff. Lots of unemployment, or lots of employment opportunities, which leads to rapid population growth, which also leads to, you know, stressed government community services, high wages, but also a high cost of living, and generally, you know, poor quality of life, in that the housing stock is busting at the seams, the community is struggling with the growth, the grocery stores are short-staffed, and you know, the education system is under stress, and so on. Inequalities abound in terms of who's sort of benefiting from the development, who's not, and that the growth is, you know, very volatile and unpredictable, and often leads to sort of sharp declines, hence the boom and the bust. So why increases in crime in these energy boom towns? And I sort of give three perspectives here. One is the demographic perspective, another is a social perspective, and then sort of a theoretical perspective, just really quickly. The demographic explanation just being that there's more people, which means there's more everything. There's more, you know, heart attacks, there's more, you know, people giving birth, there's more, you know, all sorts of stuff, and there's going to be more crime. In a lot of these communities, it's sort of unclear if the temporary workers or residents are being counted in the population. So if you see this huge increase in crime, but if you were to actually also factor in all of these transient workers, then maybe the huge increase actually per capita seems a lot lower. Also, a lot of these workforces tend to be predominantly young men, predominantly with less education. People who study the criminal justice system will tell you that a huge proportion, I'm not sure what the percentage is, of sort of crime is carried out by younger men, especially like in their early 20s, which is also what a lot of these workforces depend on. These sort of social explanations, you have lots of newcomers, lots of transient residents. People don't really know each other. They don't have a close bond to the community. You know, there's sort of a work hard, play hard culture, lots of alcohol, you know, drug abuse, you know, increased stress and depression, long work hours, again, you know, this rough quality of life with overcrowded housing and sort of community services that are under strain and so forth. And also, you know, just sort of increased fear, distrust of the newcomers, and that there just might be more sort of crimes perceived and reported in these places, even regardless of whatever might actually be going on. And you saw a lot of this in like the 70s and the 80s in the Western United States, this idea of Gillette syndrome, which were, you know, the futility and the despair of these communities, and people living in these communities, and that just basically the stress sort of leads to violence and crime and these types of social ills. Maybe the theoretical explanation I'd point to, so we got our old dead sociologists, Ferdinand Tönnies and Emil Durkheim, and both of these guys were sort of looking at the same thing, which was this transformation from sort of a rural, agrarian, traditional, community-based society to a more industrialized, urban society, and sort of looking at the changes in how people interact in these different circumstances. And you know, Tönnies is Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft. In the Gemeinschaft, you know, these small communities where everyone knows each other and they're all very close and there's sort of a strong group solidarity, versus the big city life where people don't know each other, and the bonds are very impersonal and sort of often based off of employment or trade. And there's not very strong sort of social mores or traditional values. And that sort of, you know, filters down to social control and sort of how these societies regulate themselves. In the informal controls in these traditional societies, you know, social sanctions from the leaders and from, elders and family members, these sort of strong norms and shared values and traditions that sort of keep people in line. And, sort of the worst thing that can happen, you be ostracized from the community, disowned from your family. Like, these are really important, these informal social controls versus, the big city life, where it's all laws, rules, regulations, bureaucratic systems, criminal justice system, where things like penalties, punishments are often the things that keep people in check in this sort of perspective. And so, in a sense, you could think of these natural resource communities as sort of being forced to rapidly modernize or rapidly urbanize in a way, and that law enforcement, the criminal justice system is sort of called upon to provide these more formal social controls. That there just needs to be more law enforcement, which ends up being more arrests and sort of more crime, so to speak. And there's less personal interactions, that the law enforcement is less likely to sort of know people by name and understand their backgrounds, and so things proceed more by the book. And instead of DUIs, where they just call the wife to come get them and send them home, they end up putting the guy in jail, for example, which just sort of leads to more strain on the system. And these are all just like generalities, but I think all three of those sort of theoretical perspectives and all of this, these sort of changes I've definitely witnessed in the places that I've looked at. And so happy to talk more in depth about those, the communities in Wyoming or in Pennsylvania, in North Dakota. But yeah, that's my introduction to natural resource communities and criminal justice. So I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Next, we'll turn to Christopher O'Connor from Ontario Tech University.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Well, hi, everyone. Great to be here. I think I've been researching Boomtown since 2006 or so. Done a lot of research in Canada, a lot in Fort McMurray, which is more of a city than maybe a rural area, but also I've done some research in BC and Saskatchewan and North Dakota a little bit as well. Today, I'm going to focus in, though, on young people and how they specifically navigate this sort of environment. So I'll give a bit of an overview, but Jeffrey gave a great sort of summary of some of the key issues going on in boomtowns. I mean, mostly rural environments, often focused around oil and gas, hydraulic fracturing or fracking, mining. And yeah, some of the key aspects really related to young people, and that I'm going to talk about, population growth, this sort of explosion of people coming to this, what the community members would perceive as sort of an idyllic rural setting, and disrupting sort of the community norms and that sort of thing, which often leads to crime and a host of other issues. And for me, I've often framed a lot of my research around the rapid change that goes on in these communities. This sort of, it's the speed of the change that often is hard to adjust to in these communities. So you have a lot of social, economic, a lot of new people coming into these communities. And it really depends on the type of community as to whether they can adjust appropriately to some of these new changes. And that'll vary from community, it'll vary by resource, et cetera. And so to focus a little more on young people, I think young people are really attracted to these areas for the job opportunities. There's so many different types of unemployment opportunities that come up in these boom towns. A lot of them do not require a whole lot of skill. So there's an opportunity there to really take advantage of some of that. And there's an attractiveness to these areas if you do have skills as well, because you're given a lot more responsibility in a boom town to take on projects, to show your skills. Whereas if you're in a city, sometimes it takes years and years, and you're not going to be able to showcase and get right involved in some of these things. So there's an incentive there for young people to go and really show off some of their skills and get some of that experience they're looking for. And of course, the jobs are high paying, and that's an incentive for young people to come there. Some of the risks associated with that, in particular for young people, some are delaying education. Some are, maybe taking advantage of some of the opportunities. So instead of going to post-secondary school, maybe postponing it, or going to try and make some money to pay for post-secondary education. Some are, not finishing high school and going out to work and trying to get, some cash fast. And so there are educational aspects that are impacted from the boom. And, there's often these booms are going to go bust at some point, right? So there's going to be a consequence to that. It's sort of inevitable that it'll eventually end. And so what to do after that and where to go is for young people, maybe they haven't thought that far ahead on some of that. And so another key thing for young people, a lack of supporting social services to address social problems like drug use and maybe just recreational activities. A lot of young people are moving there, not a lot of things to do in these areas, and then maybe turn to criminal activity and a lot of petty drugs and other crimes like that. So, the crime increases that accompany this often are associated with young people. These are sort of young males concentrated in one area and get a lot of crimes like simple assaults, driving under the influence, that sort of things that you would typically find associated with young men. Interesting though, there's not a whole lot of research specifically on youth crime and how that is impacted by resources and energy development. We have a bit, but not as much as you would think. And so a lot of what has been done has been sort of around the impacts on young people. And even this is sort of sparse, but it's sort of in and around crime. And so a lot of young people will have negative views of the community from some of the research we've done, and some of the early stuff from Freudenberg in the 1980s really found that young people had more negative views of their community and of growth than, say, non-boomtown young people. They felt more alienated in these types of communities. And a lot of it has been attributed to a lack of social control on the part of the community. It's sort of it used to be this sort of peaceful rural setting, or at least it's perceived that way. And then with a lot of the migration, that informal social control kind of breaks down. And the formal controls as well, right? Police are overwhelmed, social services are overwhelmed from just the sheer amount of people in the community. And from some of my research, a lot of the crime and disorder that is actually going on in boomtowns is often attributed to outsiders or newcomers. It's sort of that is sort of the issue. It's as if the crime didn't exist to a certain extent before the newcomers came. And so it's often attributed to this outsider. And I think there's a good argument to be made that a lot of the resource and energy developments impact young people to a greater degree than adults. I think adults might have a little bit more experience navigating some of these life challenges, and young people are still learning. And so that is something that they often struggle with. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of my research on young people's perceptions of the environment. And I sort of see all these topics sort of related: school to work transitions, crime, the perceptions of the environment, and whether they want to come to these places for jobs. This is one of the newer areas of my research, and I'm trying to get a sense of like, how do young people think about these towns that they're living in. So from what I've done so far, I mean, a lot of young people are calling for a balance between environmental risks and economic growth. They want to see the environment, respected, but they also want to see that economic growth because they have a stake in the economic growth. They have jobs attached to it. Maybe their families are attached to some of these jobs, and so they really stake out a sort of a middle ground and try to sort of, there are risks to mining and fracking and oil and gas, but there's also a lot of growth there as well, or potential for growth. And so one of the interesting things I'm seeing is that the environmental risks tend to be highlighted from a lot of young people who have experienced harms directly. And I'll just give an example. I mean, one of the young people I talked to, the dad had cancer, and that was sort of attributed to the company they were working for. It was sort of, they had direct experience with the potential harms, and then they really talked about the environmental risks associated with this. And direct experience with some of these environmental harms. If we think about climate change, if this is sort of a key element, maybe climate change will start to become more and more prevalent as each of us are touched by it on a more regular basis. But and young people are going to experience this climate change differently. Some are going to be participating in some of these resources that are promoting more climate change, fossil fuel industry in particular, and then others might be working in some of these areas that are working on more renewables and that sort of thing. And I'm just going to conclude with a few thoughts and some questions that I still have. And really, I would just make a pitch for more research on young people in these sort of environments. I think it's badly needed. I think we've got a little bit started, but if anyone's interested, I think this is a good area to explore. There's lots of questions left. And I mean, some of the ones that I've been thinking about lately is like, will young people continue to see rural places as attractive places to work, especially depending on if they're more associated with more dirty types of mining? Will this still be a desirable place? The pandemic has pushed a lot of people to rural areas. It'll be interesting to see if that sort of sticks or if people end up coming back to the cities. And what sort of new resources and energy developments will be needed to sustain the green economy? I think that's sort of an open-ended question around, what sort of new mining, new boom towns are going to emerge as we try to find new sources of lithium, for example, for batteries. So I think I'll just leave it there, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Next, we'll turn to Thomasine Heitkamp from the University of North Dakota.
Thanks so much for inviting me. Can you see my screen okay yet?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, great. So I'm going to talk, Rick asked me to talk a little bit about my experience in working in the boom towns of Montana and North Dakota. This was a National Institute on Justice funded study to look at the impact, particularly on interpersonal violence and what was occurring in Montana and North Dakota. We had done a preliminary study about this, so securing the funding was good because we had done some study about this. Currently, I'm at the University of North Dakota. I've retired from my faculty position, but I am working as a behavioral health research specialist at UND, and pleased to use some of my experiences out in the oil patch of North Dakota and Montana to really underscore some of the behavioral health needs. These slides are going to be posted, I think, so you'll be able to click into the link that provides the information about our study and the findings from our study. The disclaimer that National Institute on Justice would like us to provide is there. And what Rick asked me to do, and I just want to do a shout out to Rick because he's just the most wonderful person to work with, always kind, always thoughtful, always engaged. He wanted me to talk about the qualitative piece of the study. There was a quantitative piece and a qualitative piece. And I did over 100 interviews in the oil patch, talking with people really in the peak of the boom, was sliding off a little bit that last year, but looking at some of their perceptions of oil boom and the impact. You see that geographical area? You put a star on North Dakota by Montana. I appreciate that. That's the area. We saw that area. These towns that you're all aware of, Williston, the Watford city. I would share that a lot of these boom towns, and this is a dynamic, have experienced other booms. They've experienced boom and bust. And that creates a community culture, a different type of Gemeinschaft maybe, in terms of the relationship within the community. The purpose of the study really was to look at the impact of the boom on particularly interpersonal violence. You see the co-investigators with me, and you see some of these communities, and I'm just going to read them. Mandaree, North Dakota. Newtown, North Dakota. That was a new town developed because of garrison diversion. Stanley, Trenton, Tioga, in Glendive, Glasgow, Helena, Poplar, Sydney, Wolf Point. So these communities exist, and some of them have that Goldilocks syndrome more, particularly in Montana. But certainly in the heart of the Bakken, you saw all kinds of impact. I would mention that a lot of the studying I did was on tribal lands. It is the predominant minority ethnic culture in both Montana and North Dakota. And you see, even in the current census, how rural these states are. That North Dakota has 762,062 people. So when we look at our counties, 38 of 53 have less than 7 people per square mile. In Montana, 46 of 56 counties have less than 7 people per square mile. And I would say, Chris, just to shout out, I think kids are happier in these communities if they have good broadband. And I think that's a piece too, access to technology for kids, so they can get Reddit and game and some of the things that they're interested in doing. And so some of the communities, we didn't have good broadband. North Dakota tends to have good broadband. I put a quote in here from a tribal elder who has since died from COVID, about some of the impact on communities because of this boom and bust. You see in the Mandan-Hidatsa and Arikara Nation, which is in north central North Dakota, the Lewis and Clark expedition, fur traders and trappers, the steamboat industry, the settlement of the West, the homesteading, the Industrial Revolution, which eventually brought custom combines, missile silo camps, construction workers. All of these things clash and can clash with community culture, right? So you see that impact, not just because of fracking, which was occurring, and this tribe was hoping to become energy efficient with their own refinery during that time. So some concerns about those of us who do research, what we do with it, how we explain it. One of the things we made a commitment to doing with this research is we went out to the community. I drove out there 4 or 5 times with colleagues to present the findings. Talked with people about the findings. We got media around the findings, so the public felt like they could share in the findings. So these are comments that were gathered, many pages of data, run through in vivo, iterated reliability, hours at the computer. But I wanted to share some tribal elder quotes because I really appreciated their involvement. And I had tribal resolutions. I met with the tribal council to do the study on tribal lands, which I felt was so important. And how you involve that community and who you are, and the meaning of you being present there in the community when you're doing qualitative research is really important to get those voices. And so just the isolation. I mean, even though a boom is occurring, there's isolation, right? Gravel trucks are pulling off gravel roads and throwing rocks on to your car, crashing your windshield, right? So there's all these people. I was interviewing someone one time, and this isn't in here, and I said, well, what's irritating you the most about the boom? And this is in Williston, and she said that people think they can make a left-hand turn. There's no way you should be making a left-hand turn because the traffic's backed up, because these are people used to waiting through a couple streetlights, right? And there's new streetlights going up. So again, maybe some of that, the Gemeinschaft changes, right? And then a lot of concern. I mean, our research did find an increase in domestic violence, and I'm not going to go over the quantitative research today, but the law enforcement, I learned a lot about law enforcement. My background's social work, and what I learned was this was putting a lot of stress on law enforcement. And stress because they were dealing with a lot of behavioral health issues, a lot of crisis, a lot of personal crisis, and without any supports. So if someone needed inpatient psychiatric treatment, the beds would be full and they drive 8 hours to take them to a psychiatric facility. and then have to drive 8 hours back and lose that time on the beat. So just that access to addressing some of the behavioral health needs. I like this quote, the Mandan Hidatsa and Rikara Nation has one bridge connecting it. And, you know, this person says, who the hell is covering Newtown and Perth home? And God forbid it happens in Twin Buttes. Either way, it takes 2 hours to get there. So when we're studying domestic violence and interpersonal violence, what we see is, you know, the importance of having someone having access to 911, having access to support services, and how far they were away. Since the focus of this is on crime, a lot of frustration with increased gang activities, increased sex trafficking, drug cartels. With the oil business now, there's more drugs, more gangs, gang involvement, like the Mexican cartels here. You see law enforcement making these quotes about or providing this information. And I want to say, I was just so impressed that they interviewed me, and I'd wait sometimes at a sheriff's office for a couple of hours because they'd be busy giving tickets for overweight trucks. And then they'd be busy with one crisis call that was several miles away. So the fact that they participated was really appreciated. And Minot had just experienced a flood just right before the boom really hit. So you had all kinds of issues with, you know, just access to services. Increase in sex trafficking. A lot of the human service workers and law enforcement said, I think it's sex trafficking. It was new to the area or new to defining it, really. So thinking about how you provide those supports and how you do that in the very limited domestic violence space. The centers were throwing mattresses on the floor to make room for everyone. Even if they could get money to expand their center, they couldn't get contractors. They couldn't get equipment. It's some of what we're experiencing now, what we're calling that supply chain, right? They couldn't get it out there. So the trafficking was very much of an issue, and they were apprehensive about integrating human trafficking victims with domestic violence victims. Kids were involved. I really appreciate what you were saying about kids. A colleague and I do have a piece published in Child Welfare about child abuse and neglect in the oil patch. Illicit drugs, if I could wave a wand in terms of my perceptions after analyzing these data, that was probably the biggest problem. Increase in drug use, particularly methamphetamine and alcohol. And the problems with not having treatment. If you needed a psychiatric consult, you had a physician assistant that would do a telehealth in Williston from Minot, which is 2 hours away. So just getting the kinds of behavioral health supports you needed was very difficult. So just some quotes about, you know, illicit drug use and some of the impact. I like this quote because I think it gets to some of what we're talking about, especially earlier. I roughnecked in the 70s, and anything you wanted, you could get on the rig. And so it was smaller then, but I mean, it's here now. This is way beyond anything we have. You know, it's way beyond. That this was more difficult. Abuse and neglect, I think we've talked some about that. Impact on healthcare, emergency providers, ER rooms were full. We interviewed healthcare providers. All of this occurs in a larger context. And because as a social worker, you're taught to think systems and look at all these systems around the impact. Childcare, too expensive to access childcare. It wasn't available. Taking women out of the workforce. Access to addiction counselors was very limited. Isolation, social policies that hadn't been developed to adapt to a transient population. Gender-based impact of men, right? Those photos you showed were all of men, right? Those men have wives, right? They have daughters, they have families. So thinking about, you know, the impact on the whole family system. And then an increase in diversity. So the context was we had limited labor force. We had huge housing problems. People were in, you know, you heard about the man camps, and you've been to that area to study, and so you know about the man camps. In fact, National Institute of Justice used to say the man camp study, and we'd say, well, it's not the man camp study, but I was able to spend some time there. and get to know folks there. And some of them were better than others, okay? So future, Rick asked me to talk about future. I hope I'm not going over my time. If I am, just stop me, Matt. But if I had my way, I'd expand affordable housing for people moving into boomtowns. You need housing. We know how to do housing in natural disasters to many degrees. Churches do a good job working with the FEMAs and with other agencies to expand housing. We're better with telehealth now that we've had the pandemic, so we can more effectively use telehealth with good broadband. We've started to pay attention to childcare now because more women are out of the labor force. Kind of stopping that notion that substance use disorders aren't a chronic disease and treating them like we would diabetes or any other disease, really paying attention to these 20-somethings that you talked about that work in the oil fields that may need to look at their drinking behaviors or their drug behaviors and need some motivation to change. VAWA, of course, the full implementation of VAWA, and the tribes often talked about, the rest there, especially at Fort Peck. Building restrictions are an issue, transportation barriers. I just read a study, a fifth of our rural roads are in bad shape now, and the need to improve roads. Primary care providers, if people are struggling with depression and have substance use, the first place they often go in rural communities, and we saw that in the oil patch, is their physician, their family practice physician, right? And so integrating their behavioral health care with their physical care, right? And having a cultural piece to that is very important as well. So when I ended the study, I said, these are some things I want to do. So these are some publications I put at the end with some links. I looked at rural intimate partner violence in rural communities, looked at law enforcement. I could just see how absolutely exhausted law enforcement was, in particular tribal law enforcement. This is a product that we put out just this summer called Healing Our Protectors that describes some of the impact on law enforcement with some suggestions to address compassion fatigue. And this is coming out today. I'll have the link, traumatic brain injury and substance use. So a whole host of resources based on some of the needs that I saw when I did this research that I expanded. So I'll be glad to take your questions. And again, I hope I didn't go over time.
You were a tiny bit over, but both Jeffrey and Christopher had yielded you some time. So you were the benefit of them being under.
Thank you, Christopher and Jeffrey.
And finally, let's turn to Rick Riddell and hear what he has to say.
Well, thank you. Well, man, that's a hard group to follow, all the insight that you have, and most of it was gained from qualitative research, actually being in the communities and talking to people. And I think that's so valuable, and that's something that we've missed a lot of times. So most of the research done on boomtowns has looked at crime, and has found that most of the offenses tend to be fairly minor. And Chris and I are actually working on something that we call the Big Four, the Big Five: DUI, assaults, disorderly conduct, drugs, larceny, and we're trying to assess the impact of that on boomtowns. But as at least two of the other presenters had mentioned, there's a lot of emphasis now. We're looking at intimate partner violence and domestic violence, and I know that Joe Donnermeyer in the crowd here and Walter De Casaretti, they're working specifically on issues about intimate partner violence, domestic violence, including some new theories of violence. So I think that work is going to be really well received. There's a lot more awareness of the vulnerability of women in boomtowns. And also, just to follow up on what Chris had talked about what happens after a boom busts and what are the social outcomes. So this is a sort of area that we probably need to take a little bit of a look, because I think that we see that the boom ends and everyone sort of relieves and think that things go back to normal. But a lot of these small rural communities are finding that the boom leaves, but all of a sudden there's this giant addictions problem that's in the community that never got managed. And then there's increase in, because their livelihoods have been obliterated. What's happening is a lot of the domestic violence is going up because all of a sudden the stress increases because of bankruptcies and money problems. So a lot of people, I think, are going to start taking a little bit closer look at the boom and what happens when it busts. One of the limitations in our knowledge is most of the study on boomtowns has happened in North America. A little bit of work in Australia and New Zealand has been done as well. So we really have little awareness of the social impacts of booms in other places. And I know that one of the people in our audience today, Professor Perez Sinden, did some work on Spain and looked at a longitudinal 30 or 40 years of a boom from a big energy project. So I think that there's a real value to that. We really need to increase our knowledge about what's happening in places other than North America, Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, South America. And just what are the impacts of resource extraction and energy development on the peoples. And a point that Thomasine had talked about was vulnerable people, so women specifically, and indigenous people. We're finding that whether in the United States you'd call them Native Americans, we call Aboriginal or Indigenous people in Canada, but there's a lot of challenges around there. And in South America, there's a lot of illegal mining happening right now, and a lot of these peoples are just being displaced from their lands by these illegal mines that are happening. So these are big sort of much more serious crimes than the sort of drunk driving and assaults and drugs and disorder things that are happening in some of the North American boomtowns. And also we're talking about issues of environmental and human rights. And this isn't really the last slide here. It isn't really a fair statement, but I saw it on a blog. It said, for each Tesla that's sold, a child dies in the Congo. Now, the person who wrote that was trying to make a point about cobalt mining, and we need all sorts of cobalt for the new green economy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the green economy and energy prices and how that might be affecting boomtowns in the next little while. So this is just a quick energy price graph that came out in the past few days. And it just talks about the increased price in Europe and Asia in terms of coal, liquid natural gas, and electricity. Prices are skyrocketing, and even in Canada, propane's going up 300%. So most of these people who need to heat their homes and whatnot are suffering from this. And we know that as soon as energy prices go up or commodity prices go up, there's going to be renewed interest in booms. So we can sort of predict that. Now, I don't know whether this is going to be sustained for a long time, but I know that India and China have completely run out of coal. And so there's going to be probably an emphasis on extracting more minerals and more mini booms that are going to be created. There's also a big push right now for the green economy and to replace internal combustion engines with electric vehicles. And this is going to lead to a whole bunch of more extraction of resources in rural areas. And we've probably underpredicted the need for these minerals. So I just did a little bit of digging here the other day. And in 2030, half the vehicles sold in the United States are supposed to be zero emissions. So everyone's looking at electric cars. There's about 17 million electric vehicles sold every year. And so if we're going to have 8.5 million electric cars, and they all require one of these batteries, those are just the numbers of pounds of commodities that are needed for each one. And in the brackets, it's for 8.5 million vehicles. So there's going to be a real demand for new minerals in new places. And there's just in this map here, it shows some of the new areas throughout South America, Africa, Asia, that are the sources of some of these minerals and the demands that are going to increase in these places. And one of the things that we might not consider when we're thinking about rural crime is that, you have nations like Canada and the United States, we're pretty privileged in that we have, fairly good rule of law. Things are pretty stable, but and human rights are respected a little bit better than some of these other places, and where the governments are weaker and they're less able to maybe resist the money that the big money that's coming in from some of these firms. And the lives of these people are affected not only with the social impacts and crime, but also the environmental impacts. And so when I said a minute or two ago about kids in the Congo, there are one of the problems in the Congo, it's been identified by Amnesty International, is you have these 8, 9, 10-year-old kids working in mines full time, and they just have very few protections. So the World Bank is estimating that production of battery metals is going to increase by about 500% in the next 30 years. And one of the estimates out there, and I started scratching my head when I looked at this, 50 to 100 pounds of materials are mined, moved, or processed for every pound of battery produced. So for every electric battery you have in a Tesla or a Ford or these electric vehicles, it can be quite disruptive to the environment. And the lightest Tesla battery is 1,000 pounds, over 1,000 pounds. So if you're looking at 100,000 pounds of minerals, product has to be moved to generate this battery. It's going to have some pretty massive impacts on communities, and most of these communities are rural. So Amnesty International is pointing out some of the problems from cobalt mining, lithium, nickel, and whatnot throughout the world. And maybe we're going to have to change our focus as Boomtown researchers from ordinary crimes to human rights violations and state crimes. So there is maybe a change there that we have to look at. Now, part of what we were hoping to achieve today is talk a little bit about identifying some solutions. And I think a first step is developing some inventories of best practices of what seems to work at reducing the impacts of rapid population growth in these boom towns. And I think one of the big solutions is just getting on top of these things before the problem escalates too much. And Thomasine obviously identified the big problems, housing and lack of good municipal services and whatnot. But what happens is these small communities, lots of times there's just part-time legislators and part-time council members, and they get, this is the job that they do, make it $1,000 a year honorarium for doing this job. And all of a sudden their communities are slammed with this massive increase of work, population and industrialization. Thomasine also mentioned the roads, and I think that that's a real good example of the hidden cost to rural communities. So what happens is the boom ends, and all of a sudden these counties are left with, the roads are totally destroyed. It takes about 3,000 trips from a semi-tractor to do one fracking well. So 3,000 trips in the lifespan of that well. And a lot of these big heavy trucks are just destroying the roads. And some states are dealing with it. Texas, I understand, is working to impose sort of taxes on these companies while the boom is happening. And I think that we need to look at shifting the economic costs a little bit to the corporations that are profiting from these booms. And I'm speaking as a pretty right-wing person when I'm saying that. So, we have to really recognize the harm that's being done to these communities, and the people who are profiting should have to pay some of the costs of cleaning these things up. And we also have to develop and refine some theories related to the social impacts of resource extraction and energy development. So I think that all of the panelists have contributed in this way, like in terms of a little bit of theoretical development, but I think that we need to look beyond what we've already done and look really seriously at developing a better understanding of the dynamics of these communities.